Good evening. I'd like to welcome you all. It's a pleasure to be learning with part of Sfira Zman. Welcome to the third session of From Revelation to Realization, Matan, Torah, and Shavuot with Ms. Sarah Gord. Shavuot is a captivating holiday with dual significance. It, on one hand, holds a legal aspect, emphasizing giving of the Torah through the reading of the Ten Commandments, and on the other hand, embraces a human dimension through the Book of Ruth, a narrative centered around the harvest and the acts of kindness within the community. This course will examine the complementary nature of both aspects. First examining the models of revelation and the different aspects of the Ten Commandments, then shifting our focus to realization, the practical challenges when living a Torah-guided life in society, as seen in the Book of Ruth. For those who haven't had the pleasure of learning with her, Sarah Gordon is the Senior Director of Israel Education for Unpacked for Educators, which is part of Open Door Media. We're glad to have her teaching here at Drisha, and I'm going to just hand things over to her. I will share sources in the chat as things get underway. And if you have questions, if you're on no matter what platform, you can always ask in the chat. If you're on Zoom, I'm happy to unmute you, or you can unmute yourself. And with that, happy learning.
Okay, thank you so much, Kayla. Thank you everyone for coming tonight, or if daytime, depending where you are when you're watching this recording. So first of all, I just want to thank the Drisha Institute. Again, always a pleasure to be teaching at Drisha. And there's some really tremendous courses happening this month. So I really encourage everyone to try to take advantage. I want to thank Caleb Bloom for running everything on the back end and taking care of all the logistics, and Rabbi John Kelson for organizing everything as well. Thank you so much, and looking forward to our third shiur tonight. So with that, if you've been with us for our past two sessions, and it's okay if you haven't, because all of these are kind of independent shiurim, we've been talking a lot about the Aseret HaDibrot, the Ten Commandments, the revelation at Har Sinai, Matan Torah. We've really been spending a lot of time on the legal kind of revelation, the laws, the kind of Torah aspect of Shavuot. And that's definitely one important part of Shavuot. But as we've been kind of setting up in our shiurim, there's also a second aspect that's really important, right? We spoke about revelation, but now we're finally going to get to realization, right? When you have all of these laws that have been given at Matan Torah, what does this look like in practice when we actually try to implement it in a society? How successful is it going to be? Where are the pitfalls going to be? Where are the challenges? Where are the success is going to be? And what I really love about Shavuot is it really gives us a chance to lean into this duality. Right, on one hand, we're going to read the Aseret HaDibrot, the Ten Commandments, and we're going to focus on that. We spent time the past two shiurim breaking that down and doing an in-depth dive into those aspects. But now we also get a chance on Shavuot to read Megillat Ruth and to really see what happens in the microcosm of the society in Beit Lechem. How do people treat each other? What is happening? What are the challenges going to be? Where they're going to be successes? And our goal today is really to look at that and to see what happens when these laws get brought in to practical society. And we're going to use Megillat Ruth as our guide for that. So tonight's shiur and next week's shiur are really going to focus on Megillat Ruth and kind of bridging those two together. The laws aspect, the revelation, but also the realization of bringing everything together. And that's really our goal tonight. So with that, we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive into Megillat Ruth. And the aspect or focus that I want to take tonight when we think about Megillat Ruth is I actually want to compare Megillat Ruth to a different sefer in Tanakh. And I want to compare this to Sefer Shoftim, to the Book of Judges. And here's the reason why. If you look at source number 1 over here in the source sheet, the very first pasuk, the very first verse in Megillat Ruth sets the time period in which the story is taking place. And it tells us in pasuk Aleph and pasuk 1, Vayhi bimei Shvot HaShoftim. It was in the days the judges judged. This is when the story takes place. That's when the famine takes place. That's when the story and the family of Elimelech is going to make the fateful decision to leave Eretz Yisrael in a time of famine and to go to Moab. But this takes place during the time period of the judges. Now, this at first glance is strange, because if it takes place during Sefer Shoftim, then include it in Sefer Shoftim with all of the other stories that take place in that book. Secondly, and this is what we're going to spend time exploring tonight, Sefer Shoftim, the Book of Judges, and Megillat Ruth are going to seem to paint two extremely different and polar opposite pictures of society. So it's actually going to be quite strange to place them both in the same time period. And this is really the second point that I want to flesh out a little bit more. We're going to do that in the following way. I'm going to take some time to really kind of break down Megillat Ruth and see kind of like, well, what type of picture of society is Megillat Ruth painting? And then we're going to have a chance to do that at the same do the same exercise with one of the stories in Sefer Shoftim and figure out, well, what type of society is Sefer Shoftim describing? And we're going to see that at first glance, it really seems to be very opposite trajectories, which again kind of begs this question: why are we setting this story of Megillat Ruth during the time period of Sefer Shoftim when they really seem to be so different? And then we're going to have a chance to kind of like see what lessons, what takeaways we can get from this comparison, which will obviously bring us back to this kind of overarching question of the revelation to realization. What happens when we try to apply these laws into society? Okay, so with that, let's start with Megillat Ruth. And I want to invite people in the chat, if you feel moved to do so, if you were to describe Megillat Ruth, the story of Megillat Ruth, if you're familiar with it, in one word, what would you say? And I want to encourage you, you can post this in the chat. Megillat Ruth, in one word, what comes to mind when you think the first word that comes to your mind when you think of Megillat Ruth? Okay, so I hear someone posted romance. Interesting. Thank you for that. We'll see. Give everyone else like a few more moments to kind of think. First word, women. Okay, this is great. We should have made like a Wordle, right? People could kind of post, and we'll put together one of those things. Sisterhood. Okay, amazing. So I'm seeing lots of great responses. Keep them coming. Harvest. Okay, great. Chesed, okay, good. So it's interesting because I think a lot of these are such important themes that we're going to see throughout Megillat Ruth, all kind of positive. Well, I guess harvest is kind of neutral, but, it's not a negative thing. Redemption, amazing. I love that as well. Loyalty, chesed, all these kind of positive aspects. And I want to it's interesting because I think also the way that I always imagine Megillat Ruth, and I think this could be the way that I learned it when I was much younger, was that Megillat Ruth is ultimately about chesed. And I think when we do a deeper dive, we're going to get to all these amazing themes that people are posting in the chat as well. But overall, it seems to be something overall positive, right? It's about chesed, kindness, giving, loyalty. People wrote sisterhood, right? Redemption. But it definitely seems to be this overarching theme of kindness or chesed that's taking place. Everyone seems to be taking care of one another. Everyone seems to be showing chesed. And there's many types of examples of this. And, I'll go through some of them, but I'd love if people want to post also what comes to mind when you think of examples of people doing chesed, people caring for each other in Megillat Ruth, expressing kindness for one another. What are some of the major examples come up through the story? So definitely feel free to post in the chat as we go through, and I'll just, for the sake of time, I'm going to go through some of them as well. You can look on your source sheets. It's interesting that it really seems that throughout Megillat Ruth, people at first glance seem to, and we'll come back to some of these examples and dig a little deeper, people really seem to be caring for one another, right? We have source number 2 over here. We see the chesed over here that Ruth, or at least the way it's described, that Ruth does for her mother-in-law, Naomi. Boaz is actually describing this. This is in source number 2. I'll read the Hebrew, but you can follow along in English. Vayan Boaz vayomer la, hugad li, kol asher asit et chamotech acharei mot ishach. That it's been told to me everything you did for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband, right? Right? You left your father and your mother, the land of your birth. You came to a strange land. We're paralleling over here, right? The words sounds very similar, right? To the journey of Abraham. But over here, the chesed that Ruth did not choose, like her sister, like Orpah, or her, co-wife, like Orpah, to remain in Moab. And restart her life, right, and try to pick things up. But she goes with Naomi when she doesn't know if there's going to be a future, perhaps to take care of an elderly mother-in-law. So that's kind of the first example we have of kindness over here. The next example in source number 3, we see the kindness that Boaz seems to do for Ruth. That what does he see when Ruth comes to his field to glean, right? Vayitzav Boaz et na'arav lemor gam beino omarim telaket velo taklimuhu. And he says, when she comes to do leket, when she comes to pick up the sheaves that have dropped, let her also glean, not just whatever dropped, but also amongst the sheaves. Do not, don't embarrass her, right? Don't bother, don't interfere. And he also says, right, in Pasuk Ted Zayin, like, and even pull out some extras for her, right? So he wants to make sure that she, when she's coming to kind of, do her right, as a poor person, to come and glean in his field, to make sure that she gets a little bit extra. source number 4, we also see kind of another example of someone else doing chesed in a different way, which is here Naomi to Ruth. We're going to focus a lot more on this in our next sheet or next week, but Naomi tells Ruth, listen, I'm worried about you. I want to make sure that you have a future. I want to make sure that you're taken care of. And she concocts this entire plan for Ruth to go to Boaz in the middle of the night, right, in the threshing floor, and to kind of nudge him a little bit to make sure that the redemption of Ruth or the some sort of marriage will happen. But again, we see here Naomi taking initiative to take care of Ruth. Finally, source number 5, we see Boaz expressing gratitude that Ruth chooses him over anyone else, right? You chose me. It's a chesed, even though I'm a little bit older than someone we thought maybe that you would have ended up with. But we see over here many different examples of people taking care of other people. Finally, over here, we'll give another final example. Boaz performing chesed of deciding to do yibum, right, or some version of yibum over here, levirate marriage, right, to redeem Ruth and ultimately redeem really Naomi's family and the field and her property, and everything comes back. And even though Ploni Almoni, right, the other character, was unwilling to do this, Boaz really steps up and says that he is going to take upon this responsibility to redeem Ruth, to redeem Machlon, and to do this act of Yibum. So we've seen really this picture of society, and this comes up, I think, all over Megillat Ruth, that we really have all of these examples of people taking care of one another. Seems to be this amazing society, chesed, kindness, loyalty, sisterhood, everything seems to be going well. And just to kind of strengthen this point as we kind of paint this in general, but kind of, very ultra positive, society that seems to be painted in Megillat Ruth. I think that's kind of emphasized even more if we look at source here, the chart source number 7. We don't really have any villains in Megillat Ruth, and we can try to get creative. And here's kind of like a short list of like who could be the bad guys in this story. But there's no Haman, there's no Paro, there's no kind of super evil, clear villain that seems to be sticking out here. Everyone seems to just be good people. Who's our short list for kind of like the quote unquote bad guys in the story? And we'll see even these bad guys don't seem to even be so bad, right? And we'll give some example. I just see that Miriam posted in the chat. I think it's a great point, right? Another example of chesed, right? It's interesting here, right? When Naomi says, right, that Hashem has not, abandoned them. She says a little bit earlier. But the idea of, giving Naomi children, right, grandchildren, and we see that's kind of like the happy ending at the end, right, that she's ultimately being redeemed. So I think that's beautiful. Thank you for sharing. But again, when we come back to who are the villains, so one option could be, well, maybe it's Elimelech, right, and his 2 sons. They're the ones that abandon, the Jewish people and go off to Moab during a time of famine. But at the same time, it's interesting in the Midrash, takes them to task for this, right? It says that Elimelech was this, big leader. He was supposed to be like the father figure, of the nation. He abandons them during this time of famine. Even Machlon and Kilion, what do we know about them? Well, first of all, names have a great significance in Tanakh, right? And here, Machlon and Kilion really stands for kind of like, destruction and like, plague or tragedy, so kind of a lot of foreshadowing over here. We know they intermarry in Moab, and we know they die, and no reason is given for why they die. But again, this is kind of seen as, it must have been for negative actions, maybe because they left. But again, to push back, I think, if we want to think about, what would we do to protect our families in a time of famine? Would we stay or would we leave? Think about what Avraham does, right, in times of Tanakh, even though that's also sometimes, seen by different commentators, by different Mefarshim, as not exactly the right thing to do to have left Eretz Yisrael in a time of famine. Other commentators say it was fine. But again, I think, this is one example, but I think one of the themes we're going to see here with these quote unquote, when we're looking for villains, in Megillat Ruth, is it's not really clear-cut villains. It's more you have people who did din, who did kind of the letter of the law, and then you have people who do above and beyond. Lifnim Mishrat Hadin, and all those examples of chesed that we saw before are people going above and beyond. But here, the best we can do for villains are the people who just kind of did, all right, like what was expected of them. And here's another example, right, in source number 8. Well, what about Orpah? So it's interesting, the Midrash makes Orpah out to be this, very terrible character because it's mirroring her to Ruth. So if Ruth is amazing, we're going to make Orpah out to be kind of the mirror opposite. But if we want to look at the Pshat, right, Naomi tells Ruth and Orpah, there's no future for you in Eretz Yisrael. You're not going to get remarried. It's not going to happen. Like, stay in Moab. That's where you're going to have a future. And Orpah says, all right, like that makes sense, right? And she kisses her mother-in-law goodbye, Vizel. So again, kind of like if we're thinking shot level, right? Okay, she doesn't go above and beyond and go back to, and be like a stranger that sticks out to take care of her mother-in-law, but she's doing kind of the minimum. But again, I don't know if that's something negative. And our final example over here, we mentioned him before, Ploni Almoni was really first in line to redeem Ruth and decides not to, right? And he says his reason is pen ashchit et nachalati, lest I impair my own estate. That it was not clear cut, that there was a tradition, that there was a Masorah that you could accept, women converts from Moab, right? It's clear the pasuk talks about we're not going to bring someone who's male from Moab. Well, what about someone who's female? And he's just like, I don't know. I don't want people making comments about my lineage. I'm not interested, right? And again, he's not stepping up, right? But if we want to think, try to read more charitable read, like he's not, putting himself out there. He's not doing an act of chesed or kindness or anything that we see compared to how Boaz is going above and beyond. But again, is it negative or is it more kind of din and lifnim mishurat hadin, right? Kind of regular expectations versus kind of exceeding expectations as well. And I see people are putting, and I see people are mentioning, right, some of the midrashim here about Elimelech for sure. But I think it's interesting again that, if we're looking at these characters, even if we want to frame Elimelech as that, right, it's at the very beginning and then he's out of the picture. So it's hard to find in Megillah Ruth really these bad guys that kind of stick out here. And ultimately, I think when we think about Megillah Ruth, not only is it kind of ultra positive, so many examples of people doing chesed and kindness for one another, which is amazing, and we can't find real bad guys. It's just, they're not great people. They're, but they're not villains. There's no Haman, there's no Paro. It's painting Megillah Ruth as this really idyllic, almost, Pleasantville type society where everyone is kind and caring and everything is amazing. And we even get people reference, the happy ending at the end. Ruth and Boaz are married. They have a child. Naomi is accepted back by the woman, back into society. She has the grandchild in her arms, and it's this, perfect scene. And then we end off with like the lineage getting us to David HaMelech. So again, Megillah Ruth seems to be a very positive sefer. Pause. Now let's go back to our original question. Why are we setting this up to be in the same time period as Sefer Shoftim? And what do we know about Sefer Shoftim? Feel free to post in the chat, right? If you remember from some of us, if you've gone to Jewish day school, we usually learn Sefer Shoftim, in elementary school, and then hopefully we come back to it when we're a little older, because otherwise we miss some key parts. But a few things when we think about Sefer Shoftim. So what comes to mind? And we're going to see seems at first glance to be the polar opposite of what is going on in Megillah Ruth. First of all, if you remember in Sefer Shoftim, if you're familiar with it, the one big thing we have is the Shoftim cycle. There's really this cycle that repeats itself over and over again in Sefer Shoftim. Basically, what happens is you have this kind of cycle where the Jewish people sin. God punishes them by sending an invader who oppresses them for a certain amount of years. The people have remorse. They cry out to God. God sends a savior, a shofet, a judge, who comes, helps the people beat the invader, kick out the invader, and then there's peace, quiet, tshuva, repentance. Life is amazing for a certain amount of years. The judge dies, and then the people sin again, and the entire cycle repeats itself. And then towards the end of Sefer Shoftim, we have as kind of like a coda to all of the different stories that are taking place, really three stories. One of them is the story of Pasel Micha. There's like idol worship and Micha, which we're going to skip for now. This next story is Pilegesh Begiva, the concubine in Giva, which we are going to focus on, and then it ends with a terrible civil war. And that's really Sefer Shoftim. So not exactly the same society that we hear in Megillah Ruth. And to highlight this, I want to do a little bit of a deeper dive into one of the main stories in Sefer Shoftim. And that is, as we said, kind of one of those stories that comes at the end of the Sefer. The different commentators say that this doesn't mean it happened specifically at the end of that time period. It could have happened at any point during the time period of Sefer Shoftim. And this is the story. This is what we're told, Shoftim Perek Yudalad. This is source number 10 in the source sheet. And this is really a horrifying story, but just kind of paints a picture of what was going on in that society. And we'll just read some of the highlights as we go through it. So this, again, is one of the infamous stories of Sefer Shoftim. starts off by telling us in Pasuk Aleph, "Vayhi bayamim hahem umelech ein beIsrael." In those days, there was no king in Israel. Anarchy, everyone kind of did whatever they wanted to do. Important kind of, statement here. This is how Sefer Shoftim is going to end as well. And we're told a story over here of a man from Har Ephraim who basically takes a concubine from Beit Lechem Yehuda. Similar setting, by the way, just Beit Lechem, right? That's where we're hanging out in Megillah Ruth. So kind of like an interesting kind of parallel over here. And there's I skipped the first time Sukkim, basically he gets into a fight with his Pilegesh. She goes back to her father's house. He travels to her father's house and he convinces her basically to come back with him. That's kind of just like the summary of those parts. Okay, so now they're traveling back home. They've reunited. And the Na'ar, the young servant, who's traveling with them, tells them, listen, it's starting to get late. Pasuk Yudal, Vayomar Hanar al Adonav, Lachanav and Asura el Ir Hayibusi Hazot ben Alimba. And they're passing a Jebusite city, a non-Jewish city. And the Na'ar is saying, listen, it's dark. I'm getting a little nervous. Let's go rest. Let's go sleep over in the city. We don't want to be on the road. Vayomar Lav Adonav, Lo Nasur el Ir Nochri, Asher Lo B'nei Yisrael Hina, Varavarnu ad Giva. And interesting, the man says to to the boy, no, like I'm not so comfortable going to a non-Jewish city. Let's make sure we go to a Jewish city. We're going to keep traveling till we get to the city of Giva and Binyamin, and that's where we'll rest for the night. So we'll skip a little bit more. So they get there. Vayasur Sham Pasuk Tetva, Pasuk 15, Lalun Begiva, Vayavo Vayashem Berachova Ir, Ve'ain Ish Ma'asef Otam Habayta Lalun. They get to Giva. They go to like the street, hoping someone will come and invite them in as guests, and nobody is there. Pasuk Tetzayin, V'hine ish zakein ba min ma'asav min hasadeh, an old man comes from the field, ba'erev, v'ha'ish mehar Ephraim, v'hugar begivav, anshe makom b'nei yemini. And it tells us actually this old man, he was also from Har Ephraim, right? He was a landsman, right, of the person who's there now with his Pilegesh. And now he happens to live like in Giva, which is a Binyamite city, and he invites him in. And if this is sounding familiar to anyone, right, the story is being written in the same exact parallel to the story in Sefer Bereshit, the story in Genesis of Lot in stone, right? So what we're seeing over here is, and we're going to say it's going to get worse before it gets better, but that a Jewish city in Shevet Binyamin's area has basically become like stone, because it's going to be the same actions that are taking place. So everyone's hanging out, everything's all good. They're eating at this old man's home, right? He's also a foreigner, right? He's not even like a native to give up. And what happens? We're going to jump to Pasuk Chafet. Hima meitivim et libam. They're all having a great time. V'hine anshe ha'ir, anshe b'nei Bliel, and these uncouth, wicked people of the city come. Nasavu al et habayit mit dafkim al haderet. They surround the house and bang on the door. V'yamru el ish bal habayit hazaken lemor hotzit ha'ish asher ba el beitcha v'nadeu. Throw out the man who is staying in your house so we can rape him. Okay, so really terrible things that are going on here, parallel to what happens in Stone. The mob, right, demands that Lot throw out the guests. So here too, they're demanding the guests to be thrown out. Pasuk Chav Gimel, Vayetzeh alehem ha'ish bal habayit, and the old man, the head of the household, goes out and he tells them, Elachai, al tira'u na acharei asher ba ha'ish hazeh al beiti, al tasus navala azot. Don't do this. This man has come under the protection of my roof. Don't do this terrible thing. Pasuk Chav, don't worry. He has a solution. Hine bitia betula upilag shehu otzia na otam ve'anu otam ve'asula hamato be'inechem ve'la'ish hazeh lo tasu devar hanevalah hazot. And he says, don't worry, I have a young daughter in my house, and also this man, my guest, brought a pilegesh, brought a concubine. We're going to throw them out in the street. Do to them whatever you want, but do not hurt the person, my guest, who's in my home. Right? Exactly right. We're going to see right. Just like Lot, we're going to make that connection. Amazing. Thank you, Kathy, for putting that in the chat. And we're going to come back to that. And the mob doesn't listen to him. And the guest, by the way, the original character is like, he doesn't trust, obviously, his host to protect him. He does not trust that this mob is not going to get to him. And he's the target. So what does he do? In Pasuk Chafei, v'lo avu anashim l'shmolo, v'chazek ha'ish v'pilag sho, v'yotzeh alehem hachutz, v'yadu atavi taluba kol halayla ad haboker v'shachluha. Alot hashachar. So the mob doesn't want to listen. So the man just kind of like pushes his way, grabs a concubine, throws a concubine out in the street, and then she is assaulted all night. Terrible, terrible story. We actually skipped a little bit. What happens next is basically in the morning, he just kind of opens the door and is like, let's go. And she's dead. And what does he do? Pasuk Chavtet. He chops her into 12 pieces and sends a piece to every shevet. every Shevet in Eretz Yisrael at that point, right? He's trying to raise a real moral uproar as to what happened. To say that, like, since we left Yetziat Mitzrayim, this has never happened to the Jewish people. This is the worst thing that's literally ever happened, and we need to figure out as a society of tribes what we're going to do. And just to kind of summarize the end of Sefer Shoftim, and interesting, right? How the main character, he's now, oh, I can't believe my Pilegesh was assaulted, and let's get everyone against the people of Gibeah. Well, he was the one who threw her out, right? He's kind of like leaving out that part of the story. But to summarize the end of Sefer Shoftim, basically all of the tribes rallied together, and then there was a big civil war against Shevet Binyamin. They go to Shevet Binyamin, right, the tribe in which this incident took place, the city of Gibeah, demand they kind of, send out, the people who did this. Binyamin says no, civil war ensues, and Shevet Binyamin is almost completely wiped out. And again, finally, they stop the war, and the end of Sefer Shoftim is just that refrain from the beginning of the story again, Ein melech be'Yisrael, kol ish hayashar be'einav ya'aseh. There is no king in Israel. Everyone does whatever they want. Okay, so that was a depressing read, right? As people mentioned and saw, right? Direct parallel, a Jewish city has become stone. That's the anarchy that we're at. That's the level that we're at in the Book of Judges. And I think this really, highlights our big question from before, right? If we had that question before, I think it's 100 times more that, like, how can we place Sefer Shoftim Megillah Ruth in the time period of Sefer Shoftim? How could this be in the same time frame? We have this story that's almost like the ultimate, nicest Pleasantville society, and then we have Sefer Shoftim and this incident of Pilegesh Begivat. It sounds like it's Gotham City, right? It's a city of crime. It's a society where it's forget Chesed, where people are being assaulted in the street. There's anarchy that's reigning. And how are we to jive and mesh kind of these two narratives, these two stories into the same time period? So I'm going to suggest a few approaches, and we're going to come back to Lot a little bit in this, and we'll see how this all comes together. But I'm curious if anyone has their own thoughts or their own answers. How do we kind of place Megillah Ruth and Sefer Shoftim, which paint such opposite pictures, into the same society? What's the takeaway for us? So if anyone has any thoughts or ideas, I'd love to pause. You can raise your hand, you can unmute yourself, you can post in the chat if you don't want to speak up. But if anyone does want to speak up, I'd love to hear anyone's thoughts.
And just to let people know, if you are an attendee, I can unmute you, chat, or use the raise hand function. But I don't know. I always find it. I've heard like similar themes on this connection of connecting Pilegesh Begiva to Ruth before, because it's connecting Pilegesh Begiva with more the start of King David.
There you go.
And to get to King David, you have to go through Ruth.
Yeah, for sure. And I think actually my sources are zoomed in. Oh, we'll come to that in a second. But I think yes, and I'll kind of piggyback off of that, right? The way that each story kind of ends. And I think I brought that. Yeah, we're actually going to get to that. Let me skip ahead. I'll share that approach again. But it's interesting, right? If we see this chart, right, the ending of Sefer Shoftim, right, is this focus on kingship, but like the lack of kingship, right? But Yamim Ahem Ein Melech B'Yisrael. What happens when there's no king in Israel? You have anarchy, right? And what do we have at the ending of Megillah Ruth, right? We have kind of, right, as Kayla was saying, we have that genealogy that gets us to Yishai holy to David, right? And that's how we finally get to Malchut Beit David, which is, not always, but supposed to be kind of the ideal setup of tzedek u'mishpat, right? Justice and righteousness, the ultimate kind of king, modeling for the Jewish people what kingship is supposed to look like. So thank you. And if anyone else has thoughts, please feel free to jump in or to post in the chat. So I really want to share a couple of approaches that can kind of solve this problem. And don't worry, we're going to bring this back to our other question of from revelation to realization as well. So the first one, I really want to adopt an approach brought by Dr. Yael Ziegler, who runs Matan in Israel and who wrote a wonderful book by Maggid Press on Megillah Ruth. This is kind of like the book on Megillah Ruth if you're looking for a deep dive. And she frames her way of kind of answering this question is she frames it as almost a society at a crossroads with two choices. Why are we presenting these as taking place in the same time period? And she says that this is actually kind of like a literary device, right? And we're placing both these books purposely in the same time period, even though it's almost like the square peg in the round hole, right? Doesn't really seem to fit. And almost again, coming back to that idea as a literary device, is that there's almost a little bit of hyperbole that's going on, right? We're not just saying that, oh, Megillah Ruth is good and Sefer Shoftim is bad, but we're kind of like really, really going to emphasize it. We're really going to stress it, that we're going to make Megillah Ruth out to be. It's almost kind of like a caricature, right? They're like, it's the ultimate place of chesed, the ultimate place of kindness, right? While Sefer Shoftim, this is basically Stone come to life, right? That's how terrible, that's how the anarchy is. And why are we kind of engaging in this kind of hyperbole to kind of highlight those, the amazingness or the faults, right, in each society, is to show that it's not just, right, it's not just good or bad, but it's like super perfect or really, really terrible, to show the gravity of choice. And we're really trying to show here that there are two options where the Jewish people can end up, especially in this key transitional period, where again, kind of Kayla, going back to a little bit what I think you shared, where are we going to head to a stable kingdom and Malchut Beit David, or are we going to lead to anarchy, kind of, and the Jew and the Jewish nation kind of falling apart? Which is it going to be? Or do we want Sefer Shoftim, or do we want Megillah Ruth? And we kind of split it into two separate books to highlight that these are two separate stories. And I'll just read kind of a quote here from Dr. Ziegler, right? These two books remain separate because they are, in essence, two opposing models of society. In the society depicted in Judges, there is no leadership, and social interactions began to unravel. People are miserly and self-absorbed and do not recognize each other, right? In the society depicted in Ruth, Boaz assumes leadership and begins to build positive social interactions. Peace and harmony reign alongside kindness, serenity, and compassion. This situation foreshadows and anticipates monarchy, societal unity, and constitutes the very purpose of the Book of Ruth. I see there's a hand. Let me just finish one last point, then we'll pause. And again, as we kind of mentioned before, right, these are kind of the two choices highlighted. You want the choice that gets you to, in those days, there's no king in Israel and there's anarchy, or do you want the choice that's going to get you to Malchut Beit David, to David HaMelech? And we'll kind of like dig deeper into this parallel in a minute. But I see there's a hand from Kathy.
Yeah, I think that if we accept the idea that Shmuel wrote the book of Ruth, then I think it makes a lot of sense that the books are separated out, because like you said, there are moments of peace in between. This is really the text of Revelation in action. So we have the Jewish people who are capable of following and doing. Yeah, we have the juxtaposition of power and how that takes over and how we weren't able to unite. And then when it comes to Shmuel writing the text, it's a comparative study of, well, at the time, what we need, En lanu melech, now we need a king. Yeah. And I think that fits in perfectly with the story. And I wrote in the chat also that if the Midrash is right, that each son is Boaz, then those 7 years also fit in well as a sort of a comparative between how time was before and after, before the Pilegesh, if it's a chronological time.
Yeah, no, I love that. Thank you so much. And I think you're right, with Boaz being Yitzhak, right, that tradition that really tries to link them. Yeah, and I think that's a great kind of way to kind of dig deeper into this idea as well. So yeah, thank you. If other people have thoughts, please feel free to jump in. But with that, I wanna kind of dig deeper into this idea of the Jewish people really being at that, at that crossroads. Which are we going to choose? And something that Dr. Yael Ziegler points out in her book, which I think is really powerful as well, is that this choice that the Jewish people are being asked to make, this kind of national framing that we're putting on it now, right? We're going to do Sefer Shoftim, or we're going to do Megillah Ruth. This is really paralleling a choice that we saw much earlier in Sefer Bereshit, in the book of Genesis, with Lot, bringing everything full circle, as we know that Ruth, right, is a descendant of Lot, but she's going to get us to David HaMelech, right? It's kind of that loop or that tradition over here. Because if we think about Lot, he very much had that same choice, that same kind of challenge, except that he seems to make the opposite choice. And if we jump over here, if we look kind of in source 14, this takes us to Bereshit Parag Yud Gimel, Bereshit 13, where we see over here that Lot seems to be in a very parallel situation to Ruth. And we'll read kind of part of it together, right? If we remember this from Parshat HaShavua over here, from back when we read this parsha, or read this story before, you have the situation where, again, Lot is kind of, interacting with Avraham and Avraham shepherds, and there's a whole little bit of conflict. Is there enough space for everyone? Is there not enough space? And what happens? Avraham tells him, or Avram, right? It's not Avraham yet. Avram tells him, okay, let's split up, right? There's a lot of space here. I'm going to go, if I go north, you go south. If you go south, we'll go north and we'll split up. Sounds very familiar over here, very kind of parallel, right, to what Naomi told Ruth and Orpah. Listen, go back. We're going to split up. You're going to go back and go back to Moab, and it's all good. It's all good. That's just the right choice that we need to make right now. So what does Lot decide to do in the situation? Pasuk Yud, Vayisa Lot teinav vayaretz kol kikar Yarden ki kula mashkel etnei shechat Hashem et Sdom ve'et Amorah ki gan Hashem ke'eretz Mitzrayim ve'okat Soar. So Lot kind of looks around and he's like, oh, we're going to split up. What attracts him? He sees this very, very fertile piece of land that is, basically he sees Sdom, and it's very fertile. It's ki'ilu, almost as if it's like the land of Mitzrayim with the Nile. It's self-sufficient. It has everything he needs. You can almost see the dollar signs, right, lighting up in his eyes. Vayivchar lo Lot et kol kikar Yarden ve'yisal Lot mikedem ve'fardu ish ma'al achiv. Right, in Pasuk Yud, Lot chooses that area and he travels there and they split up, right? And then it tells us, interesting over here, right? Lot ends up living in Sdom. Usually Tanakh lets us decide on our own. People or places are good or bad. Here, kind of the objective narrator weighs in. Pasuk Yud Gimel, va'anshe Sdom ra'im v'chata'im lahashem, or the people of Sdom are very wicked and they sin against God. And what I think is very powerful over here is it's almost this inverse parallel, right? We know over here that Lot ultimately is going to be the forefather of Moab. We know that he features heavily in that story, that origin story of Sdom, right? We'll talk more about that next week, right? But that seems to really parallel, Pilegesh Begiva, what Pilegesh Begiva is based on. But over here, when he's asked, do you stay or do you go? He chooses to go to Sdom. He makes a choice. And what we see when he's kind of made that choice, and this is Bereshit 19, if you look at source 15, this is the parallel story, the original story that Pilegesh Begiva is based on. And I think over here we see what happens to Lot's values when he's made that choice. And here we have a chance to kind of, zoom out from the national really to the individual. And if we're familiar with the story, right, it's almost the same parallel, right? The two messengers who are secretly angels come to Sdom. Lot invites them in. He's the only one to. He's still trying to model Abraham's, Haknasat Archim, taking in guests even when he's in Sdom. So, points for Lot, at least for trying. But then what happens? The mob comes, they bang on the door, and Lot says, no, I'm going to send out my two daughters. Do with them whatever you like. But here, at least the disaster is averted because thankfully his messenger or his guests are really angels, and they strike everyone down with blindness, some sort of plague. And no one's going to be harmed. And they tell Lot, we're leaving now. Like, get your family, get it together. We're taking you and we're saving you, and it's over. We're leaving Sdom. And here's, I think, for me, when I read this narrative, the saddest part of the story, right? Lot made the choice to leave Avraham. He thought he could do it. He thought he could maintain his values in Sdom. And first of all, we see just the perversion, right? He takes in guests. But what does he do? He's like, oh, I'm going to protect the guests by throwing my daughters out to the mob. So we see kind of how those values of Sdom have impacted him. And I'm just going to skip down over here. Here we go. Pasuk 14. This is really, I think, the saddest part. Vayetze Lot, vayidaber el chotnav l'chlei benotav. And he talked, I guess he had two other daughters who were married. And he goes to his son-in-laws and he says, he's like, let's get out of here. God's going to destroy this place. Where we're going to get out. And he's seen as like a laughing stock in the eyes of his son-in-laws. Like, he took all these steps, to kind of join Sdom, and what's he left with, right? He's not accepted by the people of Sdom, right? His son-in-laws think he's a big joke. They're not willing to leave. And finally, he has to take his wife and his two younger daughters to run out. We know even his wife turns around. She's lost as well. She can't make the break from Sdom. And finally, Lot's left alone in a cave with his two daughters. And there's that final story of incest, right, which we'll focus on next week as well. And that's the origin story of Moab. And over here, I really think this is just this tragic, sad story of the demise of Lot, right? He had this choice. Is he going to stay, even though it's difficult, and try to make it work? Even though Abraham is telling him, Abraham's giving him the out, but are you really going to leave, the protection or the good influence of Abraham for Sdom? And he says, yes, he's going to make that choice to go to Sdom. And look what happens. Look what he loses. And look what happens because of this choice. And then look at source 16. We have kind of the inverse, right? When Ruth is told by Naomi, go home, go back to Moab. You don't have to come with me. She says in perhaps some of the most powerful words in Megillah Ruth, right? Ki el asher talchi elech, ubasher talini alin amecha ami ve'elokayach elokai, right? Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and my God will be your God. And just to quote Dr. Ziegler again, right? She says over here, Ruth's choice represents a historic connection or tikkun of Lot's fateful separation from Abraham. I'm just going to skip down a little bit to the underlined part, right? And she highlights the parallel word of separate, right? Vayipardu, right? The separate word that comes up with Abraham and Lot, and it comes up again with Ruth and Naomi. We'll just skip to the underlined part. In fact, Ruth's speech refusing to abandon Naomi, despite her urgings, should rightly have been uttered by Lot in response to Abraham's suggestion that they separate. By pronouncing the speech which Lot failed to deliver, Ruth brings the narrative of Lot and Abraham's separation full circle. Ruth is not the only one who's faced with the choice of remaining in Moab or returning to the path of Abraham. This is the very choice facing the people during the period of Judges, during Sefer Shoftim. Will they continue on the path of Moab, a path that will surely lead to their destruction, or will they return to the ways of Abraham? I think to kind of recap this first approach, right? We said, why paint Sefer Shoftim, Megillah Ruth as two kind of, such opposite societies? It's really just to highlight the gravity of the choice the Jewish people have to make in that moment, right? Are they going to try to be a society that's going to base themselves on, Megillah Ruth as that motto, or are they going to follow Sefer Shoftim into anarchy? And we just saw again, I think this powerful kind of choice is not just a national choice. It's what we see in different characters in Tanakh as well. It's why Ruth is so important. She's coming to be metakein, right? To fix the fateful mistake that Lot made, right? Lot is the one who makes the choice to go down to Stone, right? And kind of like abandons those values, makes the wrong choice, gets assimilated into Stone culture. And even though this is the origin story of Moab, right? Ruth is kind of the spark that comes out of that, who's able to do the inverse, right? She makes the choice to return. She makes the choice to stay with Naomi, right? And to be that paradigm of someone who's pushing a lot of the chesed that's taking place in Megillah Ruth as one of the kind of positive main characters. And I think that's something that's so important that we see as this option, right? Ruth is really the one who's coming to be mitakein. So this is really the first approach that I wanted to share. I also want to share one more, and then I'd love to pause and see other thoughts that people have. One other takeaway I think that we can see from the parallel nature of these two books of Sefer Shoftim and and Megillah Ruth is that perhaps this is also a cautionary tale. And what do I mean by this? Before, we described Megillah Ruth as this idyllic society based on chesed. Everyone's amazing. It's the opposite of Sefer Shoftim. But what I want to do now is I want to kind of chip away at all of that. And let's chip away at some of those examples of chesed that we kind of gave before as these examples of such chesed and Megillah Ruth. And they're important. But I think that, if we chip away a little bit, we can kind of ask ourselves, well, wait a second. Is Megillah Ruth really this amazing, perfect society? Or if you chip away a little bit, do you start to see that, listen, it's not Pilegesh Begiva, that's a horrible story read in Sefer Shoftim, but maybe it's not so far away. Maybe there's potential for this society to kind of go down that path. And what do I mean by that? So let me explain. I want to go back to, and this is the title I gave kind of this approach is like, let's take a closer look at Beit Lechem. Is this real chesed? Is this fake chesed? Or is there somewhere in between? And one of the examples that we gave of the major chesed, as we said before, is Boaz taking care of Ruth. Boaz tells his workers when Ruth comes, let her take extra sheaves when she's doing leket, when she's gleaning, don't bother her, and throw out a few more sheaves on the ground for her to pick up. Right, so the ultimate chesed over here. But let's like chip away a little bit at this and see if we can get to something deeper behind the surface. And I think over here that what I want to ask is, are people really helping each other in Megillah Ruth because they want to, or are there sometimes ulterior motives, right? Is Ruth the exception or the rule in the way that she acts, right? And here I think this could really be highlighted in the example of Boaz. And I want to kind of do a little bit of a deep dive in the end of the second parak of Megillah Ruth. This is source 18. So source 18 is right after Boaz takes care of Ruth and he, tells his workers, really take care of her. He sends her home with some extra food. She's all excited. and she comes home and she tells her, shows it off to her mother-in-law, and her mother-in-law says here, right in Pasuk Yutet, like who helped you? This is amazing. Like whose field did you end up in? And I'll just read the underlined part. V'teget lechamotat asher asta imo v'tomar shem ha'ish asher asiti imo hayam Boaz. Here's everything he did for me, and the name of this guy who helped me was Boaz. And Pasuk Chav, Pasuk 20, V'tomer Naomi lekalata baruch hu la Hashem asher lo azav chasto et hachayim v'tamitim v'tomer la Naomi karov lanu ha'ish migolinuhu. And Naomi sees this as like almost like an example of divine providence, hashgacha pratit. And she says, this is amazing, right? This guy who's helping you, Boaz, this is, and she, blessing God in the middle of her sentence. He is related to us. He is one of the people who can redeem us, right? It's like, oh my gosh, all the pieces are coming together, right? And they talk a little more. Ruth gives her some more details. And Naomi tells her, okay, stay close to him. And you can almost feel like, I feel when you read the end of Perek Bet here, this anticipation that like things are finally going to change for this poor family, right? For Naomi, who comes back with nothing, and Ruth is the stranger, and she's like the poor person, just trying to pick up, sheaves wherever she can in the field. Their fate is finally going to change. This person, Boaz is going to redeem her, he'll marry her, it's going to be amazing. And what happens? She stays in his field for the rest of the harvest. Pasuk Chaf Gimel, Vatidbak ben Arot Boaz lakate ad klot ksir sorim ksir achitim v'tashem achamotah. And then the harvests are over, nothing has happened, and she goes home. End of Perek 2. Perek Gimel then begins, Perek 3, source 19, where Naomi is like, all right, nothing's happening. We got to get things moving. And we're going to focus much more on this next week. But she basically creates this whole scenario that she wants Ruth to do, which Naomi seems to feel will force Boaz's hand into publicly redeeming her, publicly marrying her. She's basically going to send Ruth in the middle of the night, maybe leaves everything ambiguous, maybe to entice him. We'll talk more about it. But again, it seems very much to be this whole plan to force Boaz's hand, because Boaz is not stepping up here to do anything. And ultimately, Boaz, when he finds Ruth in the gore in the middle of the night, he's like, oh, yes, I'll redeem you. And he goes to the gate and to the elders, and everything's redeemed and everything happens. But it took some nudging. And I think over here, what I'm trying to kind of point out, and I'm curious what people think about this. And this is why I put, instead of crosswords, like danger ahead. Maybe this is really the cautionary tale, that as much as Megillah Ruth is founded on chesed, if we dig a little deeper, maybe this chesed, like really Ruth had to just stay there in the fields for that whole time, and no one was going to step up and help her. And we needed this whole, operation at the Goren to get Boaz to step up. And if we want to dig a little bit deeper more, right, we know when Naomi comes back, the women are all like, oh, like, is this Naomi? Like, what happened to her, right? And it's this moment of humiliation, right, for Naomi. And why are people not exactly welcoming her, right? Why is she being treated this way? And again, I think there's almost this sense of danger. We spoke before of there's din, right? Like kind of letter of the law, and lifni mishra hadin, and going above and beyond the letter of the law. And what I want to kind of prompt us to think about when we hear Megillah Ruth being read on Shavuot is, are these examples of chesed like pure chesed? Well, these people are going above and beyond, and in some cases they are, and often it's Ruth. Or is this kind of a little bit more, self-serving, or is this not exactly these shining models of chesed? And perhaps that's where the cautionary tale comes in, right? This warning that, like, listen, like, go down this path where everyone is just taking care of themselves, and there isn't this altruism, and there isn't this going above and beyond. You're on your way to Pilegesh B'Giva and Sefer Shoftim. Probably not going to get there. Hopefully it won't be that bad, but there's a darkness there. And when we start to think about from revelation to realization, and what happens when we want to build a society, right? Bringing these laws of the Torah into actualization, right? Chesed is hard, and we'll talk more about that next week, right? But like, how is this going to play out? How do we create a society that looks like Megillah Ruth and doesn't have these kind of undercurrents of, is this real chesed, or did I feel that could have been done better? That could have been done in a little bit more of a charitable way, like that action. And is this getting us more Megillah Ruth and really Ruth as the paradigm, or is we digging a little bit more into Sefer Shoftim territory, right? Like, and I'll just give another example, right? We said before with Naomi not being welcomed, why don't they just give Naomi back her land, right? When she comes back, like, or here, right? It's so nice that they're letting Ruth slave away in the fields and they're throwing some extra sheaves her way, but help her, right? What might the society look like if it's rooted in lifni mishurat hadin, going above the letter of the law, and not just, again, kind of the letter of the law. And I'm curious, I'll pause here, right? Those are really the two examples that we gave. And I want to close with a midrash, but I want to hear what people think. So I'll just give a short recap, right? We spoke about, we're going from revelation to realization. We spoke about, why is Megillah Ruth put in the same time period as Sefer Shoftim? We looked at all the parallels. We said, number one, maybe it's a crossroads or a society. Are we going to choose Megillah Ruth society, or like positive, super positive, or are we going to choose the very negative Sefer Shoftim? We spoke about how Ruth undoes the terrible choice of Lot, right? Bringing her, how to make the choice to do the right thing, to choose the good influence, to not be cast away, to not let oneself be cast away. And finally, we said kind of a second approach is really the cautionary tale. Are the examples of Chesed and Megillah Ruth really pristine Chesed? Or could people have done a little bit more, right? Kind of looking at this example of Boaz, or how Ruth is treated, or how Naomi is not welcomed back. And perhaps we're trying the nudge to the reader by putting them in the same time period as, listen, there's good things happening in Megillah Ruth, but are these underpinnings that could get us to Sefer Shoftim? So those are kind of, I think, two ways to frame this, hopefully, and two ways that, again, highlight that when we try to take the Aseret HaDibrot, the revelation, all of the mitzvot, and apply them in practice in society, it's hard, it's difficult, it's messy. What does it look like to create an ultimate society when there's always that danger of a society kind of starting to slip into Sefer Shoftim territory? So I'll pause here. People have comments or questions, and if not, we'll close with what I think is actually a beautiful midrash that brings us all together in Ruth Rabbah.
No questions in the chat on Facebook.
All right. Well, if people have more questions, definitely feel free to weigh in. And with that, I want to actually close with what I think is actually one of my favorite midrashim on Megillah Ruth. This is our final source in source 20 in Ruth Rabbah. And the midrash tells us the following. So Amar Rabbi Yitzchak bar Marion. Rabbi Yitzchak bar Marion says, Ba hakatuv l'amdech. The pasuk comes to teach us she'im adam oseh mitzvah yasenu belevav shalem. That if you're going to do a mitzvah, do it with your whole heart. Really lean into that mitzvah. And it gives kind of three examples of what does that mean to do a mitzvah with your whole heart. And it gives three examples from Tanakh, and the last one will be from Megillah Ruth. So the first example he gives is this interesting phrase, the way that this midrash puts it. She'ilu haya Ruven yodea, shakadosh baruch hu machtiv alav, vayishma Ruven v'atzilenu miyadam, b'ketfo haya molicho etzel aviv. If Ruben had known that God was going to write down what he did with regard to Yosef, aka it was going to get written in Tanakh, right, in Chumash, and it was going to be written down that Reuben heard and tried to rescue Yosef, right, from their hands. What would he have done? He would have put Yosef on his shoulders at that moment and carried him back to his father if he knew it was going to be written down. And he gives a second example. Ve'ilu haya yodea Aaron, shakadosh baruch hu machtiv alav, hinehu yotzeh likratech v'tupimu machalot haya yotzeh likrato. And if Aaron had known that it was going to be written down in Chumash that he was going to go out to greet Moshe, his brother, right, and give him honor, even though he was older than him, he wouldn't have just gone out, which is what's recorded. He would have gone out with a marching band, right, with drums and with singing and dancing and a huge parade to greet Moshe. And finally, bringing it back to Megillah Ruth, Ilu haya yodea Boaz, shakadosh baruch hu machtiv alav vaitzvet la kali v'tochel v'tishba v'totar agalot mefutamot haya machila. And if Boaz had known that God was going to write down that he had given Ruth some tasty roasted grain, he would have upped his game. And what would he have prepared her? Fattened calves, right? Like a huge feast. Okay, interesting. And then it kind of ends in like a nice way. V'achshav, right? Well, it says, here, Rabbi Cohen, Rabbi Yeshua Diskin, B'Shem Rabbi Levi say the following. L'she'avar, in the past, Haya Adam oseh mitzvah, and Navi kotva. In the past, you did a mitzvah, and the Navi wrote it down, and everyone would know about it. So what happens now? V'achshav k'shadam oseh mitzvah mi kotva. Now, when we do good deeds, who writes it down? Eliyahu kotva u'melech HaMashiach v'kadosh baruch hu chotem al yadehem. Eliyahu, Elijah the prophet, and the Mashiach write it down, and God signs it. Okay, why do I love this midrash? Why am I bringing it here to close out our shiur tonight? So what I think is fascinating about these three examples is the Midrash is not picking 3 examples of people who did nothing, who sat on the sidelines, who did not get involved, did not choose to step up, and then kind of make the point, you should have stood up. That's not, you should have gotten involved. You should have done a mitzvah. That's not who we're talking about here. We're actually choosing people who did the right thing to a certain extent, right? Reuben fights for Yosef. He tries to save Yosef. Aaron goes out to greet Moshe. Boaz feeds Ruth. They could have all told themselves when they went to sleep that night, I got involved. I stepped up. I did what I had to do. Zehu, and we're done. But I think what the Midrash is getting at here, as we said before, there's din, right? There's meeting expectations, and then there's lifnim mishrat hadin. Then there's exceeding expectations as individuals and as a society. And I think what's being pointed out here is a lot of times, and I feel this for myself often, we're like, okay, like, I used to feel this a lot when I was a teacher in the classroom. Like you see like a student is a little bit upset, and I would, go up to them after class, hey, are you okay? And they'd be like, yeah, I'm fine. And I'm like, oh, I did it. I'm the good teacher. I reached out to the student. I asked if they were okay, and they told me they're fine. So they're really fine, right? But if I really wanted to think in that moment, right? Okay, the student kind of brushed me off. Like they're not so fine. Like I should have asked them to sit down. I should have followed up. I should have maybe nudged a little bit more. There's more I could have done. But since I kind of gotten involved, I could pat myself on my shoulder and say, oh, I got involved. I'm one of the good guys, right? I'm fine. And I think that's the message of this midrash is to all of us in different points in our lives. And we tell ourselves we're the good guys. Like we did get involved. But if we think about it more, there's so much more we could have done, right? We could have done this mitzvah, this act in a much more full-hearted, like really, intentional way. And I think that's really the message over here, right? We said at the end, right, there so many times in Megillah Ruth where, okay, like the good guys are stepping up, but they really could have done a lot more in this situation. And ultimately, I think that's the question I want us to be reflecting about when we think about bringing Matan Torah into, Megillah Ruth, is what type of society do we want to create? Do we want to be the society where, okay, I got involved and I'm fine, or we want to really think intentionally, is there more that I could have done, right? How can I be more of a Ruth model, in this example, right? How can I really go above and beyond in these situations, creating the type of society that hopefully I think we'd all want to live in. So with that, I'll leave you with those prompts, those reflections, things to think about Sefer Shoftim and Megillah Ruth and their comparison, and ultimately what this means when we think about transferring, the huge experience on Har Sinai to what this means for day-to-day life in Megillah Ruth. So thank you again to the Drisha Institute. Thank you to Kayla and Rabbi John Kelson for putting everything together. I'm happy to stick around if anyone has any questions. Otherwise, my email address is also at the top. Next week, we're going to finish off this series. We're going to look at some other parallels in Megillah Ruth. We'll look a little bit at Megillah Ruth, comparing it to the story of Tamar and Yehuda. We'll compare it a little bit more back to Lot and his daughters and see what we can learn from that as well. But looking forward to learning with everyone next week.
Thank you. And I just want to highlight one class that's coming up. Our weekly Parsha Shir discussions on the Parsha is meeting this Thursday at 12:30 p.m. Eastern U.S. time with Rabbanit Leah Sarna. And with that, I hope to see you all here at this class next week. Thank you, everyone. Take care and have a good day.
Thank you, everyone.